Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Welcome to another episode of the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands. Joining me today is Justin Williams. Hi, Justin.
Good morning, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. And today we're going to talk about how to perform a title search. So before we get started with the details, we're going to cover a few basics and the outline of how to do this on your own. So the purpose would be if you have recently inherited minerals or you've got minerals in your family and you just don't really know what to do with them and you want to have the documentation necessary so that you can understand how much you own and then use that as the basis. For example, if you get a division order in the mail that tells you that you own a certain percentage in a well, to be able to validate that on your own. Or perhaps you have inherited minerals and you need to get a title search done to identify any gaps in the chain of title so that you can correct those and give that information to the operator so that they can start paying you. Justin, can you tell me a little bit about your experience on doing title search?
Absolutely. I mean, that's square one for me was figuring out, where was the title, where were the gaps in the chain of title. For us specifically, we were contacted by the oil company and said, hey, we believe these minerals are owned by you. However, we need these documents to help us fill in the gap of the chain of title. And trying to figure out all this information and take it all in is a huge learning curve, but it's what you've got to do to be sure that you have everything taken care of the way that you need to. And in my scenario, we, as the current owners, needed to file some deeds for the oil companies so that it was clear for them and there were no problems paying now and in the future.
Sounds good. Yeah, and that's a pretty common thing, especially when you inherit minerals. Oftentimes, mineral rights won't be included in that person's estate, and so they'll just be sort of stranded out there. You may have some estate documents or like a will or a trust document that outlines that here are the types of property and these are the people that have inherited it. And then maybe you run across the scenario like Justin mentioned where out of the blue an oil company contacts you and says, oh, by the way, you have these mineral rights and we're drilling a well and we'd love to pay you, but we need some documents in order to clear up the title defects. And so in that case, you would need to get a title search done and, work with a landman and or attorney to come up with the necessary documents to cure those gaps in the chain of title so that there's clear and marketable title in your name, and that will allow the operator to be able to pay you royalties. So that's an important thing to do. If you want to sell them or if you want to get paid, that's a prerequisite. So we'll talk about today kind of where to begin. So that you want to start at present day. So when we talk about chaining title, what we're talking about is documenting back through time to when that land was patented by the U.S. government. And what that means is basically the first time that the U.S. government granted that parcel of land to a private individual. And along with that, in that initial granting, they were given the rights to the surface as well as any mineral rights that went along with that. So what you need to do is track that back from today because you know who owns it today. Like, so for example, if you have a deed, a mineral deed or a warranty deed or quitclaim deed, for example, in your name, that's the starting point. And then you want to look at who granted that to you. In other words, who gave that to you, and then go back through the chain. And we'll talk about kind of step by step how you can do that and the different options for doing so, and if you need help, how to get help. And at the end of the day, give you enough information, hopefully, to be dangerous to do a basic title search on your own if you needed to. The caveat being, like always, if you are unsure of what you're doing, get professional help from an attorney or a landman, and they can help you navigate these waters. So.
Absolutely. And to that effect, Matt, a great thing to mention here is in Texas, for instance, sometimes these mineral rights can get split so many ways and become such a headache, even for professional landman, that sometimes you have to get somebody involved and be prepared to ask many questions as you go through the process. Because I know for me, it had my head spinning.
It can get confusing quickly, like Justin mentioned. If you have an example where somebody grants the minerals to 10 different people, all of a sudden you have to then track those 10, if you're doing a full title search, those 10 branches in the tree to present day. So typically what you're interested in, though, I will say, is what they call a limited title search. So you're really specifically interested in your tract of land and your fractional ownership of those minerals. So rather than maybe the whole pie, you're interested in just a couple of slices and understanding your slices of the pie, because you could go back, like Justin said, if you wanted to understand the whole pie, that could go back and be very time consuming and complicated endeavor, when really all you need to know is just your part of that pie. So the first step when you start to look at a title search, if you have the deed, if you happen to have that, if not, if you've inherited minerals, you want to look at the estate documents from your relatives. There might be a deed in there that granted your relative those minerals. And so again, you want to look for words like mineral deed, quitclaim deed, warranty deed. The description in the document will actually dictate what type of deed it is, regardless of what it says in the title. But there are a couple of key parts of a deed to look for. And this is important when you're doing the title search, because these are the key pieces of information you'll look for and try to understand what that document is saying. The first piece is the grantor, and that's the seller or the person that's granting or giving the property. You have the grantee, which is a buyer if it's a purchase, or the person that's receiving the property. For example, if you're inheriting those, that would be where you would be the grantee. Your grantor might be your grandfather or your mom or your dad. And then it usually includes an address of the grantee, so the person that is getting the property. And what they'll do is after they file that with the clerk and recorder, it'll be recorded, and then the original will be sent back to the grantee so that they have a copy of that. And then another big piece of that is really what the description of what's being conveyed. What you'll be looking for here is description, and it'll say, it is the intent of the grantor herein to convey unto grantee an undivided, and then it'll give like either 10 net mineral acres or the number of net acres under the described lands in the proportions set out above, or it could say 100% of all right, title, and interest to the lands described above. And then it'll talk about things like with the right of ingress and egress all times for purpose of mining, drilling, exploring, etc. And this is an example of like a mineral deed. And it will, if it's under lease, it'll say something like, this sale is made subject to any rights now existing to any lessee or assigns under any valid and subsisting oil and gas lease of record. And so what it says is, if the person, perhaps it was your grandfather, let's say, and they leased those minerals back in 30 or 40 years ago, and there was a well that was drilled, the lease is still effective. And what it's saying is that you would still be subject to that lease. And so just because you're conveying the minerals doesn't negate any existing leases or any of the previous agreements that were made in terms of leases or royalty deeds or things like that. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The big thing is that it will have the legal description on there, and that's an important thing that you can use to start your title search.
Absolutely. And the devil is in the details with the deeds as well. It's all about what it says. As Matt mentioned, it doesn't really matter what the title says. As laws have evolved, it really matters what the content itself of the legal terms are in the deed.
That's right. Yeah. And so, as you get into this, that's where you need to really get a copy of each of these instruments and read them so that you can understand exactly what was being conveyed, what was being reserved, and things that you'd need to know, effective date of the transaction. That's a good thing to keep track of. And we'll talk about this in terms of a free template we'll have on our website at mineralrightspodcast.com/episode 10. And so it'll be a run sheet template with a couple of examples on there so that if you do decide to start doing a basic title search on your own, you have a place to record this information. It'll have some of those key pieces of information you need to keep track of. As you get into this, so you have a copy of that deed. We've talked about the legal description. I've got a link to my blog that talks a lot more about legal descriptions and how to read them and what to look for, and we'll link that in the show notes as well. But once you've got a copy of that deed, what you need to look at is the grantor. And so you identify the grantor, and what you need to do then is to search for the transaction when that previous owner was granted the property. So if you were the grantee, in other words, let's say your grandfather was the grantor, what you want to do is look at in the records at where your grandfather is the grantee for those minerals or for that piece of property. And so this is where you would need to go search for your grandfather's name and then identify any previous grantors that match the legal description of that property. So that's important where you have, so what you would need to look for there is that person that is the previous grantor, look at that deed, look at the description, what was being conveyed, if there's anything that's being retained. So, for example, if they maybe retained a portion of the minerals or all of the minerals, that would be something that would be outlined in that document. And so you just keep searching up that chain of title, they call it. And so you think of each transaction or each of these instruments along links of a chain. And so what you're looking for is going up that chain back to the very beginning. And then you just keep doing this over and over and over again with respect to searching for the grantor's name and then identifying the previous owner before them and then the previous owner before them. And then you just keep track of all this in a run sheet, like I mentioned. And what you want to look for are things like the document type, and we'll talk about specific document types to look out for as you're doing your title search. Talk about the reception number, and that's just the unique number that the clerk and recorder gives to that instrument to be able to identify it in their records, or the book and page, which is the way that documents were recorded back prior to a lot of the electronic databases and digitizing these records. The effective date of the transaction, which will be recorded on the deed itself, and then the date that the document was recorded. It's important to know because that's when it is made available to public record. And then, again, the grantor and grantee are important, the legal description, and then you can make note of any comments or any exceptions that you might need to be aware of. This can be a super time-consuming process, as you can imagine, as you go back through time, and especially, like Justin mentioned, where you might have several times where these minerals might be granted to multiple people and then granted to multiple people again. And so each of those branches in the tree starts to get more and more broken up. And so it becomes very difficult to track that back, or more time consuming to track it back over time.
Absolutely. On the flip side, I found it to be a very fun process, also to be very informational and getting to see the history of what's happened and some of the prices and some of the very old documents. And you'll be amazed that sometimes you'll go back to the 1800s and even different records and land patents.
Yeah, I agree too. I'm a history buff, and so I always like to go back and see some of those old historical documents. It's always really cool. Another kind of tip that I'll give, if you aren't really sure where to start as far as the name of a person, what you can actually do is go to the U.S. government, and they have online the list in a searchable database where you can look at the patent record. So you can go to the U.S. Department of the Interior, the BLM website. They have a general land office, and you can go to that database and search for the original patent documents. And you can go do that at glorecords.blm.gov/search. And you can search by the location. So if you know the legal description, this is where you can enter that. You can search by the state, county, and then input as much as you know of the legal description and go to search patents. And it'll come up with a list of those initial transactions. And you can then go to the specific legal description. It'll list on the search results the date of that granting, the document number, the state, talk about the township, range, section, and aliquot. And then you can go to that specific legal description, select the document, and then actually view a copy of it. And so it'll indicate the names on the document. And so it'll have, here's one that we looked at in Arapahoe County that shows Albert Abenheimer as the person that was granted this homestead, and it was in May 20th, 1862, and he was granted 160 acres. And so you can actually look at the copy of the document, view the tract on the map, and if you don't know the actual name, you can actually go back, if you know the legal description, and find out, kind of work it from all the way back when the land was initially granted to somebody, and then work your way from there and look at that person as the grantor and look at who's the grantee. And so you can kind of work it backwards that way as well. That's another way to kind of start to get a picture of, how it came to be that you were given those minerals and how much you actually own. And so that's another helpful resource and that's free. Now, a lot of times they don't have all of the patent images available, but you can get, if you know the date it was recorded, then you can use that information to go to the county and be able to find a copy of that there.
Absolutely. And another thing to keep in mind as well is if who you inherited this from was a business partner, sometimes you can lose it by not knowing a business name. So sometimes it helps to know family history and what that individual was doing at the time and what they were interested in or what businesses they ran. I know for me, I ran into that a couple times with different business names, and we didn't really know that those were associated with our predecessors. Yeah,
that's a good tip. If they have a name of the ranch, maybe that was the other thing where sometimes they'll put it in the name of the ranch versus the name of the person. So that's kind of how you do it. So if you're going to do a title search, those are the steps you would typically go through. We'll talk about document types here for a minute. Justin, what are some of the common document types you've run across in doing some title search on your property?
Absolutely. The first thing that really threw me for a loop was understanding what was a quick claim deed, what was a warranty deed, what was special warranty, and what was different. That was the number one. And then leases play into that. And for me, leases were very confusing because it's a different type of conveyance and a different thing that you have to look at. There is no two alike in my experience with different deeds, and you really have to read it carefully to know exactly what was conveyed.
Yeah, and if you're unsure, just do a quick Google search, quick claim deed, and it'll talk about what that is and then what the difference may be between that and a warranty deed, for example. We won't cover that today, just that you could cover a whole episode on the different conveyance documents and what they mean. But just in general, we'll talk about the types of conveyance documents and instruments to look for that are relevant as you're doing the title search. So the first, like Justin mentioned, is a deed. Another one is a personal representative's deed. Another thing to look for is, on that same vein, if you have different estate documents like wills, an affidavit of heirship, and things like that you would want to look out for. If those were recorded, you want to understand that because that would affect the ownership. The other thing too, like Justin mentioned, is lease. And so that's where you could have the obvious, if we actually have a lease, a copy of the lease itself. Oftentimes, especially lately, there's companies that would just record a memorandum of lease just to document that lease exists. They will not file the copy of the lease itself because they want to keep the terms of the lease confidential, but it will have things like the legal description, the lessor, the lessee name, the effective date, the term. So that's another thing to look for, as well as releases. So if you have the lease that expires and is not extended, then they will file a release to document that that's no longer in effect. And so those are things to look for. What are some of the others, Justin?
Production payments was something that definitely was unique to the oil and gas industry and something you run across often. And I know there are several situations those can occur.
And have you run across that with your property?
I have. I've ran into a couple where it was actually a condition of sale. So the condition of sale was that whoever was receiving the property would pay $250,000 towards the person selling the property. Once that was done, a release would be issued, and then they would own those properties.
Okay, so that's a good one. And then also, like if a lease is assigned, so that's another one where maybe it's originally leased by ABC company, and they decide down the road to assign that lease to XYZ company, maybe as part of a purchase. Another example that, like Justin gave, you'd see in a lease assignment. And so that would just identify who the current holder of that lease is. Other thing is often you'll get into is like a pooling agreement. Another one where perhaps not totally obvious, but if somebody might have used their mineral rights as collateral, or just the property in general, if maybe that was something where they own both the surface and the minerals, or fee simple ownership. If they mortgage that property, you'll have a deed of trust. And so that's typically where you might get something, especially if they're in the business of buying and selling minerals, where maybe they put minerals up as collateral to get a loan for some other investments. And so that's something you'd want to look for.
Absolutely. I've also seen liens in a scenario with different documents. Maybe the person was a working interest owner and they did not pay the dues of an agreement. And sometimes a lien can be placed on properties and liens can also be released. I know partial assignments was also something that got me in trouble in different times. At times when you convey the documents, you don't have to convey 100% of everything. So a partial assignment would just be conveying a piece of that interest.
It's something where you definitely want to read the full instrument itself, and that'll outline if it is something that maybe they're only granting half of their interest as an example, and that's something you'd need to keep track of. And as you go through the process of tracking this down through time, you need to keep track of all of those special assignments and different nuances, those instruments in that run sheet, so that you can piece together how many net mineral acres you're left with at the end of the day. So those are just a few of the document types to look for. It's not a comprehensive list, but just a few that you would need to be on the lookout for as you're going through the search. So next step is, okay, you kind of know how you do it, you know what to look for. Now we're going to talk about where do you go and do this actual search. So Justin, where have you gone to do a title search in the past?
Thank goodness. Texas is wonderful in that most of the records are digitized. And so typically I hop onto the county's portal. Sometimes the counties work with third-party providers, and you're able to look those up. Sometimes there's a per document fee. Sometimes you can view those for free and you're charged to save them. But it's a great way to get yourself started. And I know there are some counties in Texas even that you have to go to the county courthouse. And I'm sure that would be a very enjoyable experience.
Yeah, I'm sure it'd be a good history lesson, although you definitely would get to know the folks in the courthouse on a first name basis, because you'll spend some time there. So the thing that you'd want to look for when you first start the search, so whether you're doing it online or in person, what you want to look for is first go to the index. And so whether you're doing this online or in person, you need to start with the legal description. They'll have an index by both the legal description and both the grantor and grantee index. So if you know the names, you go to that grantor and grantee index. And for that specific property, you'd want to keep track of that and make a copy of that index so that you could use it as reference as you're doing the search. Similar with the legal description, it'll have for that specific. Typically, it's by section, township, range, and you can go in there and look for. You have to kind of weed through the other transactions that are in that section that maybe aren't relevant for your specific tract, but that'll give you a place to go to look at all the different transactions. So as each of these documents are recorded, they're recorded in the index as well, along with the reception number, the book and page number, and that's how you can go and track that down. Like Justin mentioned, if you're fortunate enough that your county in question has got these records online, you simply go to their website. It'll oftentimes allow you to search by the various attributes, whether that's the reception number, the book page, grantor, grantee name, the legal description, the document type. You can really search it through various different ways to get the results that you're looking for. And then they'll have information on how to perform the search. So they'll have some online help stuff. So you can go to that specific county and look there at how to do that. The other thing, and typically I will say one thing, those title plants are very closely held assets. So title companies that have copies of all this don't just let anybody look at it for free. So If you're not in a county that has that online through the county itself, or even if it does, it may only go back to the mid-90s where they started to digitize documents. So if you need to go back prior to that, you have to either go to the courthouse yourself and do the search, or find somebody that has those documents that have been digitized in their records. And some abstract companies have that. I know I've used a company called skld.com. They have some Colorado counties online where you can search. You have to sign up, and there's some different ways you can get a membership or get an account with them. And it's not expensive. So if you just need to be able to search a document, here and there, you can do it on a per document basis, and it's just a couple of dollars per document to get a copy of that document. So if you know the specific reception number, book page for those documents prior to the mid-90s where those online records stop with that county, you can go to a website like skld.com to pull those. It's not, again, if you want to look at the index, it's something where they a lot of times will just go in person and go and peruse that. You can't take it with you. You can make a copy of the pages you need, and that there's a cost for that. But it's a very closely held asset, again, like I said, because they spend a lot of time keeping that up to date so that they can do title searches, and this is where that's how they make their money. So that's another resource. Who else have you run into that you've gotten help from to get this done, Justin?
I have actually found in Texas that the county tax assessors can be a big help in trying to find out if there is property that taxes are being reported for your predecessor. So whoever had owned that property before, you can actually go and search in their name, see if there have been taxes reported for that property. I know in a few different counties I've been able to actually find out a legal description through that, and then been able to go back and find records.
Oh, that's a great tip. Yeah, that's another good source of information. And that's oftentimes maybe the clerk and recorder's office hasn't made their information available online. You can go to the assessor, and they oftentimes will let you go online and pay your bill online or search your tax bill. So that's another good place to go. The other thing, too, is if you get in over your head, if you're getting into this and you say, wow, I'm not really even sure where to go next, definitely get some professional help. And that's where you can hire a landman that can do a limited title search for you. And you want to limit the scope, because if you give them free reign, you say, this is where my property is located. Go ahead and I want to get a full picture of everything. They'll go spend a couple months, and they'll come back later and give you a hefty bill. And really all you need to do is a limited title search maybe on the specific tract of land in question. And so you want to be specific about what you need, but then they can go do the title search for you and deliver a run sheet. So it'll be an index basically of all the transactions and leases over time relevant to that tract of land, along with copies of those instruments if you want copies of that as well. And so you can ask that specific landman how long they think it would take given their experience in that area. And obviously it just depends when they start getting into it as to how long it's going to take and how much that'll cost you. But if you have an idea of the scope, and you can just say, hey, this is how much I have budgeted, what can I get done for this? And just kind of work with them and see how they can help you. But if you need that completed, oftentimes you just have to bite the bullet and pay, a couple $1,000s. Sometimes it'll be a couple of weeks and a couple $1,000s to do a limited title search and give you the run sheet and those instruments, and then identify as well any gaps in the chain of title that you might need to cure. And if that landman isn't an attorney, you would need to potentially hire an attorney to help you put those documents together and to go through the process maybe of probating a will or going through getting a determination of heirship or something like that, so that you can fill those gaps, have clear and marketable title. So like we talked about at the beginning of the show, give that to an oil company so that they can take your account out of suspense and start issuing royalty checks to you. Or so if you want to sell that property, that you can actually do so and convey that to another person or entity.
Absolutely. And a great tip of advice you actually gave me last week, Matt, was ask the oil company. Ask the oil company what information they have in regards to your interest and your ownership. Again, it can be a closely guarded secret. Sometimes they may not want to share, but they have some information, so it doesn't hurt to ask if they can share that with you.
Yeah, and especially if you have in the context, if you get a division order and you say, "Yeah, I'm curious as to how you got to that number. Can you please share the basis for that?" And they are sort of obligated to do that because especially the more information you can give some specifics. If you think perhaps that your interest may be higher than what they show in the division order, you can use that to find out more information and see how they came up with their net revenue interest and make sure that you're getting paid what you deserve there. So last thing I will mention, though, there's also other websites out there that digitize records from hundreds of counties across the country and then make it available for a fee. And that might be useful if the county in question doesn't have online search capability and you need to do that, but you don't want to make the trip out to the courthouse. You could perhaps subscribe to one of those sites to perform an online title search, on your own to get some of that information.
Absolutely. And also with a great thing that I learned when you're going through this process, oftentimes it benefits you to speak to a landman to get some information about what you're going to be doing first. I discovered with working with title attorneys, they will act on the documents provided to them. So if they're performing a limited title opinion for you on your tract of land and a document is missed that you didn't see, couldn't find, that is not considered by the attorney, which is kind of eye-opening, or at least was for me.
Yeah, so I guess the caveat here, again, this isn't legal advice. If you do, this is really kind of more for informational purposes. If you do decide that you want to do a title search, definitely get help to help you through that. Maybe it's just a brief conversation with a landman or an attorney to make sure you're on the right track. And the thing, too, is you can actually do a hybrid version of this where you can do, like Justin mentioned, you may have pulled some of these instruments yourself and put together a run sheet. And if you're going to give it to an attorney to do a title opinion, like he said, you're going to need to have a complete picture. So it might be worthwhile to contact a landman to help you make sure that you've got all the bases covered. And so they can actually perhaps do a title search and just use what you've provided to them as a starting point or the basis for their own search, so that they can actually quickly go through and validate what you've put together versus starting from scratch. So that could be also another solution, is to have as much as you can do online or on your own in the courthouse, and then give that information to a qualified landman to help you fill the gaps and to make sure that it's correct. So that's it for today's show. Check out the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com/episode 10. And you can get a free runsheet template to do this on your own if you do decide to go down this route, or at least to know what a run sheet is. If you do hire a landman, you can know what they're going to be sending you and how to read it. So that's a free resource we have out there. Thanks again for listening. Again, to share your thoughts. We really want your feedback and want to know if this is helpful. And if you have any questions that you'd like answered on the show, and you can do that on the comment box below the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com, or you can send us an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Leave us a voicemail at 720-580-2088. And we will definitely answer questions on the show. If you leave a voicemail, we'll feature your call on the show, and look forward to getting those in the future. And to help us out and make sure that we're reaching all the mineral owners out there that need this information, please leave an honest review on iTunes. Your ratings and review really help, and we read each one. And definitely please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get this podcast so that you don't miss any information in the future. Thanks again to Justin Williams for joining me this week and providing the mineral owner's perspective. And until next time, thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.